Hello and welcome to Bristol Ideas. I'm Andrew Kelly. I'm joined today by art historian Dr. Amy Jeffs. Amy has researched and worked in the British Museum and the British Library and is an artist, composer and singer. All of this work comes together in two wonderful and beautiful books, Storyland, A New Mythology of Britain, and Wild, Tales from Early Medieval Britain, which we'll be discussing today. Amy, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Can we start with your approach? I have to say, reading your two books was a great pleasure. A journey through paper records and natural landscapes of your work in the library and your walks in the wild. And you bring together deep reading and the creation of art as well as music to tell these stories. Tell us about the approach.
Well, I think studying the Middle Ages was very liberating because this is a time in which the boundaries that between genre and media and materials that we think are so important today when we approach these things at school or at university, they just didn't exist then. So you could tell a story in the ways that came naturally for telling that story. And I'm thinking of of manuscripts like there's one from France, a high medieval manuscript containing legends of Alexander the Great, and they're written in French verse, so the kind of the language of the people, a language that could be, I mean, this is an elite product, but for this poem to be recited aloud, it would have been suited to that. But it also has these marginal images on one of the opening pages of men and women playing instruments and singing. And so that reminds us that although this is a book that may have been read privately or in small groups, it's also a kind of mnemonic for performance. And it's a thing to be illustrated. And so that's just, one example of how my research has brought me to lovely reminders that we can storytell in a host of ways, in ways that make sense according to our own interests and abilities and what's demanded of us by the narratives.
So you bring together text material in your books, but also you use linocuts as well.
Yes. So Storyland has at least one linocut in every chapter, and it really began as linocuts. I was living in Frome in Somerset and writing up my thesis, which was all about chivalry and illustrations of ancient legends in medieval manuscripts. And I decided I wanted to try illustrating a really brilliant mythology of Britain called The History of the Kings of Britain, 12th century text. It has giants and magicians and goddesses making prophecies, and this was very much procrastination. So I was scampering to the studio, the Black Pig printmaking studio in Frome, every afternoon and taking proofs of what I'd been working on the night before, and so it was once I had a set of illustrations that I was sort of able to take them to people for advice and say, how could I turn this into a book? And the idea that emerged was a chronological retelling of the myths of Britain, in the same way the wood engravings that are found in Wild. And again, there's one per chapter in Wild. It's a slightly more formal book than Storyland. They began before the idea of the book emerged. They were something I was working on in the very start of the first lockdown.
And just to round this off, in the audio versions, you've introduced music as well, haven't you?
Yes. So one of the things I did in Storyland to try and, with the retellings, I found that it had a great deal of variation in the style of the original medieval texts. I was drawing from chronicles, from vernacular legend in verse, which is much more kind of exciting. I was looking at poetry that was much more tightly wrought, kind of Scandinavian poetry. And some of them were quite interested in the emotions of the characters. Some of them weren't. In some cases, when the emotions were explored, they were taking an angle that maybe wasn't so interesting for us today. It might be more to do with the threat of tyranny. Actually, that's pretty interesting today, but whatever. And I was wanting to, for each story, be true to the medieval plot line, but find an emotional angle that felt compelling and relevant to me, and then hopefully, if it felt like that to me, that would translate to other readers. And so I was using the linocuts to an extent to kind of, especially at the beginning, it was really the illustrations that were helping me hit on that moment of drama and high emotion that was most interesting in the story. But as I got into doing the linocuts and I was kind of done 30 out of 40, I found this kind of complacency setting in. And I'm not a highly trained musician. I'm a singer, but not in any really formal sense. But I did start sitting down at the piano and coming up with songs, which was a little bit like distilling the story from a kind of long drink down to a shot. It was, if that's distilling is the wrong word, sorry, if any chemists are listening, they've probably got their heads in their hands. But finding that shot of meaning or emotion in the story that could then be woven through, that's what the songs provided. So with Wild, because that kind of happened organically with Storyland, there was no time to incorporate the songs into the book by the time it was published. But with Wild, I approached the publishers and said, this is probably a bonkers idea, but would it be possible to illustrate the audiobook with music? And they're wonderful. And they came back and said, yes, we'll talk to the legal team. And so I worked with a very good friend of mine and a very highly trained musician composer called Robbie Haylett. And I was able to, I composed 6 of the 7 songs he composed. He composed one of them, but then he took them and really forged them into beautiful pieces of music and he'd read a draft of the book and he knew, so it was 1 per chapter, and he really took that atmosphere and interpreted it musically and brought it into the songs, so that now when you listen to the audiobook, and it's a fairly short audiobook, it's 3 hours 40, but I think it's quite deep. The producers took stems from each of the tracks so that the chapter opens with a motif. You have the short story, and then it closes, and again you have a little bit of music taking it into the non-fiction commentary, and then at the end of the commentary you have the song, and that gives that chapter that unique atmosphere.
We've been talking a lot actually in some of the work we do in Bristol about how you make audiobooks different, and I think you're a really good example of this in the work you've done. Can I ask you about the importance of mythology and why these stories are important and indeed in some cases relevant today? They're from a long time ago, but you can learn so much from them, about the past, but also about now.
Yes. Well, one of the things it's hard to speak for everyone or make general statements on this, but my feeling about these stories is that they stop me being patronizing towards the past and the people of the past. I think they're an important lesson in the sophistication of human cultures, regardless of the technology that's available to them. And they throw up themes that we are continuing to face, like grappling with the threat of doom or the fact of mortality. These are things that we collectively and individually have to contend with. And in the case of Wild, some of the sources are so revealing on that subject and so emotionally urgent that it's a great comfort. They are also, the poems that I explore in Wild, a lot of them are from a manuscript called the Exeter Book that's in Exeter Cathedral, and they're known as the Old English Elegies. And many of them have a sort of narrator who's experiencing some extreme situation, like being cast completely adrift on a frozen ocean alone in a boat, and they're reflecting on former joys and the loss of former joys, and then how to make peace with their situation. So it's a very bleak poem for the majority of the poem. This particular one is called The Seafarer. It's very bleak, but it comes around to this idea of hope, and that idea of hope is manifest in a kind of Christian paradigm. That there's also this hopefulness and this is something I kept on thinking about in the very act of creating the poem. Although it's got these dismal themes, and many of them do, and these themes of great longing and of despair, The Old English verse itself is very highly wrought. It uses alliteration, it uses stress, and it's very playful. It quite often puns, or uses a device called kennings, which is things like saying that the sea is the whale's road, which is a very beautiful idea, because of course we can't see the roads of the whales, but they know them. And that is itself so hopeful. The very effort of creating something beautiful is something that we do in a spirit of hope. And so that's a way in which I found this material, these stories, to be inspiring and galvanizing in the modern day.
That's exactly how I felt as well, and the Seafarer was a prime example of that, and I'll probably return to that at the end. Just we've done quite a lot of work on the mythology of Bristol from the early days, supposedly, of the city being formed by two giants battling over wanting the maiden Avona, through the forgeries of Thomas Chatterton when he pretended to be a medieval poet monk. And then right up to the
we've all been there.
We've all been there. Right up to the present day, we actually do. You should come on this sometime. We do a walking tour of urban myths of Bristol now, where this researcher who's collected urban myths of Bristol for decades takes you on a tour of the city centre and talks about some of those myths. And we found that quite useful to explore certain things. For example, two of the myths about Bristol are about the naming of streets and the view that this is linked to the slave trade, White Ladies Road and Black Boy Hill. And actually the difference, that's not the case, in fact. But it does give us a chance to explore those things as well.
I mean, it's fantastic. I used to really enjoy, so I lived in Cambridge for a long time, and enjoy going around sort of telling the stories that weren't true about Cambridge. And that's often the reasons they've been shared and made popular are as interesting as the once you've myth busted and found the true version.
Can we also talk about legend and truth? I'm a great fan of westerns, and these are films and books, of course, based on myths. And there's a great line in the western The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, when the truth about the character played by James Stewart becomes apparent, but it's decided not to reveal the truth. And the person talking to him says, "This is the West, sir. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend." And you write that medieval tales bear only a passing resemblance to true history, but they offer many other kinds of truths.
Yeah. Well, I became very interested in my research into how the stories that I use in Storyland are, some of them more fantastical than others, and probably would have been perceived as such by the medieval imagination. But many were presented as history. And there was a certain amount of dissent within the medieval scholarly record as to how much can be believed and how much should be, especially around Arthur. But, basically, broadly speaking, these things that we're calling myths now were perceived as history by around the we're talking like maybe 1300 or something like that. This was the kind of definitive history of Britain, and that includes there are slightly different ones for Scotland and for England, which I go into in the book. And those histories were used, as we use them now, to justify certain claims to territory or to political power in different areas, and things like female rule. It was these sources that were picked up and plundered for historical precedent. And so because of that, and they were used rhetorically, they were used in arguments to justify real political claims and wars. And for that reason, they did shape history, arguably. And so, and they were also being written at the time and retold at the time. So history in turn began to shape them. And this is something I became very interested in, and that is my understanding of how they hold other kinds of truths.
Yeah. And you mentioned King Arthur there. Could just give one example from Storyland, perhaps give that one about that story and how and what that theme will come through now.
Yeah, so in 1191, the monks of Glastonbury Abbey dug a hole between two what they called pyramids in the graveyard in the cemetery of Glastonbury Abbey. These pyramids probably weren't what we're picturing now, literal Egyptian style pyramids. They were more like obelisks that were probably the remnants of some Anglo-Saxon high crosses. So we think maybe the kind of things were decorated with interlaced ornament and that kind of thing. And they were probably erected by so they in commemoration of some Anglo-Saxon founders. But anyway, they stood in the cemetery, and the monks started digging a hole between them and found a hollow oak trunk, and inside and very, very far down, and inside the hollow oak trunk they found two skeletons, and one was of a man, and he was so big that one of his eye sockets was the width of the palm of the biggest man there. And he was lying with a woman, and her golden hair remained. And it says that one impetuous young man who was at the scene jumped down into the pit and picked up her hair, and it crumbled to dust instantly. And very conveniently, there was also a lead plaque facing down that said, when they lifted it up, it had a cross on it, and it said, "Here lies King Arthur," and it's been translated as, you know, his second wife, Guinevere. And this was a source of great excitement for the monks of Glastonbury, especially they just had a really big fire and they needed to help fund repairs. Not to be completely cynical about it, but this was one of these things that was seen as being of great importance. And a scholar called Gerald of Wales, who was around at the time, he reports this incident in a text called On the Instruction of Princes, and he says it just goes to show that that the Britons, and he is himself a Welshman, but he says that these silly legends that go around about how Arthur's going to come back and redeem the Britons are nothing more than fiction and fairy tale. But he doesn't say that Arthur doesn't exist. You know, he's fully on board with Arthur having lived and having been a very important warlord. But then what's fascinating, the second sequel to this legend is, or this event, is that in the reign of so we come to now the reign of Edward I, we move about 100 years later. Edward I is claiming overlordship of Scotland. He's got imperial ambitions. He is very interested in the cult of Arthur and in British myth, and especially appropriating the mythic history of the Britons, even though he's an English king. Well, he's not an English king, he's an Anglo-Norman king. He's King of England. He sees himself as heir to the legendary founders of Britain, so Brutus and Bladud and King Lear, and these figures that come up in Storyland. And he also sees himself as an heir to Arthur. And it's any legend of Arthur returning is quite inconvenient to him, but it's also the fact of Arthur's body being at Glastonbury is an opportunity for him to associate himself with Arthur and really put to bed this legend of his return, and he maybe even intimate that he's the embodiment of that returned Arthur. So he organizes for Arthur's body and Guinevere's body to be translated into a opulent black marble shrine and placed in the sanctuary of Glastonbury Abbey. So right at that moment, where if you imagine going into a cathedral, and Glastonbury Abbey was huge. When you go to it now, it looks like the ruins look like two very big separate buildings, but actually you realize they were just one enormous vessel. And you imagine going in at the West End through those big doors, and how you've got the nave, and then you have often a step up into the area known as the choir at the East End, the holiest end of the cathedral. And that's where Arthur was placed, same place as where the shrine of Thomas Becket was in Canterbury Cathedral. And so it's a really spectacular placement, and a very, very wealthy and important abbey in the southwest. and imagine it in black marble,
Yeah.
candle lit. It must have just been absolutely beautiful. And it's a real statement, a really powerful political statement being made by Edward I.
Now, Storyland has many stories like this, but I want to move on to Wild now. And now, in Wild, you cover stories of earth, ocean, forest, beast, fen, catastrophe, and you end with paradise. And you take inspiration, as you mentioned, in the Old English poems in the Exeter book, but also ones from Wales and Ireland as well, don't you?
I do, yes. It's not really possible to separate these literary cultures in this time. There was the English-speaking people, the sort of the Anglo-Saxons, we call them, really made up of numerous Germanic tribes who had migrated from Scandinavia and West Germany. They have populated the area that we now think of as England, and but they're pagan, and they're converted in a two-pronged attack by missionaries from Italy and missionaries from Ireland. And the Italian missionaries land at Kent, and the Irish missionaries, they sort of use Iona as a springboard. And the Northumbrian culture of there's this number of monasteries spring up in Northumbria, including Lindisfarne and Wearmouth Jarrow, and they are founded by Anglo-Saxon nobles who have been converted under Irish missionaries. They also are receiving education from Kent. There's a lot of mixing, but the influence of the Irish church is profound. Irish missionaries also carry on onto the continent and have a massive influence there as well. And so the saints' lives and the cultures of the Irish church was very interested in ascetic monasticism. So that's the kind of thing where you go off on your own into the wilderness and you spend 3 hours of every day up to your nipples in freezing water praying. And they were interested in following the model of the Egyptian desert fathers who'd gone out into the wilderness. Britain provided some of the wilderness of the fens, a very soggy version of the Egyptian desert. And that was kind of would have had these lonely monks living out in it. But for that reason, when we look at the literary culture of early medieval Britain, whether it's in English or in Welsh or in Latin, we're seeing a real mixing of cultural traditions. And we can't say that that's not Celtic or that's not, and I think a page of the Lindisfarne Gospels is a wonderful example of that. The Lindisfarne Gospels are digitized, so if anyone's listening and curious, you can just Google them and you can flick through now digital facsimile on the British Library website. But every gospel book, and there are 4 gospel books within one actual book, there's only one volume, but they open with a carpet page, as it's known, so a page of full geometric decoration. And then the first page of the gospel text has enlarged capital initials that kind of get smaller and smaller and then turn into what's known as the book hand. And those initials are also densely decorated with geometric ornament, both inside and outside the initial. And then so the pages kind of swirl. And so you go from this absolutely solid decoration on the carpet page and you transition slowly to just the written word. And it's an amazing example of the kind of word made flesh. You have birds sort of interlaced inside them and things. But in terms of the ornament that you see on those pages, you've got the ribbon interlace and zoomorphic interlace, as it's known, that we see on the metalwork of Visigoths and Ostrogoths across continental Europe. And that is strongly associated with Germanic barbarian quote unquote tribes. But you also see these beautiful swirling trumpet spirals and triskelies, these coils and circular motifs that are associated with Celtic metalwork. So again, metalwork, but different kind of tradition. And that those motifs are found all over Ireland on brooches and things, but they can also go as far back to an Iron Age Celtic settlement in Switzerland, in a site called La Tène, where there's an embossed mirror was discovered, which also has these embossed circular swirling motifs, and those are combined on the Lindisfarne Gospels pages, along with Greek letter forms and the Middle Eastern, derived text of the Gospels, and the carpet pages themselves are highly evocative of prayer mats, which it's been suggested were actually in use in Rome at the time by Christians, but have close ties with the Islamic world, and so there's just in Wild I try to evoke that kind of constant cultural cross-fertilization. It sounds very, very technical. I actually, in this book, I'm focusing on different aspects of an old idea of the wilderness, and really trying to do that through storytelling. And so it's predominantly original short stories, but there are short commentaries following the stories that place them in the context of this incredibly vibrant and interesting early medieval world.
I think it's also worth noting that at the end of Wild are some new translations of the poems, aren't there, from the Exeter book?
There are, and they've been done by a friend and colleague of mine called Dr. George Young, who teaches Middle English and Old English literature at the University of York, and he's a wonderful poet, and so the translations really, they tread the line between accuracy of linguistic accuracy and that kind of accuracy of spirit or meaning that is so tricky with translations. And sometimes if you get a very quote unquote accurate scholarly translation, it might feel very void of the beauty of the original. And so he's done a marvelous job of translating them in a way that is really appealing, I think, to contemporary audience.
No, I agree. I think it's a tremendous piece of work, and I'm always in awe of translators, I must say, who can create whole books, new books from an original work and so on, let alone the poems and so on. It's interesting you mentioned the Fens, because that was one of the stories I wanted to talk to you about, because one of the areas we're interested in is how ideas travel, how they get communicated and taken up. And the Fens, I think, includes this, doesn't it, in the way that the Germanic tribes came over, and you had the some of the origins, I guess, of Christianity. Is that right?
Yes, so I look at the Sutton Hoo ship burial, which is dated to about 625. The Italian missionary effort in Britain came in, I think it's 597 AD. So it's really the conversion official had only been in play for about 30 years. And when the Sutton Hoo ship burial was created, and you can see that ambivalence. I mean, there are Christian objects among the treasures found in the ship, but the very fact that it's a ship burial and probably a royal burial with grave goods speaks of a pagan Germanic culture. I think that sense of ambivalence or ambiguity is really at the heart of the elegies that I mentioned earlier. They're found in a collection of 95 riddles, and they themselves are very enigmatic. There's one, the one that describes the Fens is called Wolf and Eardwatcher, and it begins, Wolf is on Eje, ich on Othra, fast as that Eland Fenneby Wurpen. Wolf is on an island, I'm on another, safe as that island surrounded by fens. And it's narrated by a woman who seems to be in love with somebody called Wolf, but married to somebody else, a warrior who has the limbs of an animal. She kind of describes these bestial limbs, but then Wolf seems to turn against her at the end and kidnap her whelp. She's using these synonyms or words that can also be associated with dogs and wolves and beasts. And she's out on the fen. And even that description of safe as that island surrounded by fens, it evokes this kind of riddling landscape of the poem itself, but also of the real wild landscape of the fens, where you would have to know the waterways like the back of your hand, not to get lost and to not end up stuck in the mud. And it's fascinating, the symbiosis between the these real life landscapes, and then the psychologies and the psychological landscapes of the poems.
One of the things that you talked about earlier was about the cross-fertilization of cultures and so on, and that comes through a number of the stories, doesn't it?
It does. Yes, there's one of the sources I use is an Irish text called Bhuaile Shuimhní, or the Madness of Sweeney, and it's a legend about how it's quite a funny beginning. You know, there's a chap called Sweeney who sees, he's not Christian, and he sees a Christian priest trying to consecrate an area of ground near his house to build a church, and he gets really cross and he runs out of his house to stop the priest, and his wife tries to hold him back and pulls off his dressing gown, or the equivalent, and so he runs naked to the priest and remonstrates with him, and I think he throws his Psalter, Book of Psalms, into a lake, and the priest is so angry he curses Sweeney to perpetual flight and to restlessness and to death by being wounded with a spear. And so Sweeney is then cast up into the air and spends the rest of his life wandering the air, naked and alone and apart from human society. And in his travels, he crosses the Irish Sea and he spends some time on Ailsa Craig, which is a volcanic outcrop off the coast of South Ayrshire. And then he goes from there into Britain, mainland Britain, and spends a year living in a forest. And it describes how he hears this kind of crying or wailing coming out of the forest, and meets a man called Fair Colour, that just means wild, or man of the woods. Yeah. And Fair Colour is kind of the Britain's leading madman, wild man, he strikes up this kind of friendship and between them, and this is explored by a poet called Sean Hewitt, he's a contemporary, he's working now, and he did a kind of queer reading of this relationship in a recent book of his called Tongues of Fire, and they sleep in the original text, they sleep 2 trees distant, and Fair Colour is tormented by the sounds of the cries of birds, and so Sweeney sort of keeps watch for him, and it's very beautiful, and then Fair Colour says he needs to go because it's been prophesied that he will die by falling into a waterfall pushed by the wind, and it's a very beautiful story, and I wanted to use it for Wild because of how it uses the forest as a place of madness, and because it has this great character in it, Fair Colour. There's also a Welsh poem called Claf Aber Ciawg, which is very similar in its genre and in some of its techniques to the Old English elegies, and it's contemporary, probably 8th century. And so this has encouraged some scholars to see them as just different linguistic versions of the same tradition. And that is about a man who's been exiled to the forest because he has leprosy. And it's a very sad poem, and he does the same thing as the elegies, in his narrative voice does anyway, with descriptions of the natural world combined with descriptions of how he feels. So it's things like, there is ivy growing on the oak stump, my clothes are getting loose, I can hear the cuckoo calling, I know I will be ill tonight. And so in my sort of wanting to work with these poems, I felt sorry for the leper of Aber Ciawg, as he's known, because we never find out what happens to him. And as far as I know, he never has any friends ever again, within that fiction of the poem. I took the liberty of combining him with Fair Colour so that he has this relationship with Sweeney and then an opportunity to die, because the death that Fair Colour believes he's going to meet is one that he also believes will take him to heaven.
I mean, you have a wonderful way, I must say, of getting inside all these characters, and you feel as you're inside them as you're reading them, really. One of those is the story you start with, which is in Wild, which is the wife's lament. And you have, this poor woman buried underground, and you say at one point you imagine her watching the slow creep of the sun rising from her dismal prison. Wonderful image, really, but a sad one too.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I think it's coming back to what I said at the beginning, is when you're working with such beautifully crafted poems and artifacts, you can go to quite dark places without it feeling hopeless.
Yeah. Another story that I want, you talked earlier about the seafarer, and you talked about the hope that comes out of that story, and you also refer to, the kind of themes of that which resonate very strongly currently, and will do increasingly in the future, about migration and people moving from place to place.
Yes, I mean, I think one of the ideas that I was interested in writing Wild was the idea of the wilderness as a place without paths, and it came coming to those kinds of kennings that I mentioned, like the sea being the whale's road. Birds are described. There's an encyclopedia from the early Middle Ages by a writer called Isidore of Seville that describes all kinds of phenomena in the natural world, and gives them these fictive etymologies. And he says that birds are called avia because they don't follow paths, as in via being like the Latin for road. And I mean, in trying to, we are, one of the themes that then I sort of drew out of this was this idea of us having to build paths through the wilderness. And in my own mind, that also means sort of strategies for navigating the future, and that being judicious path builders probably is something I was interested in. There's, I don't know how to what example to give. There's in Beowulf, Grendel is a monstrous character who lives in the fens and who approaches the hall Heorot, which is the hall of halls. It's this beacon of community in this wasteland, and he hears the laughter coming from inside and the sounds of community, and he feels desperately alone, and knowing that he cannot become part of that community, he turns to destruction, and he enters in, and he fulfills his monstrous destiny by tearing everyone limb from limb, and destroying that place. And I found myself, when I was, and I talk about this in the book, when I was treading these little footpaths through the reed beds and snake maltings, unable to really get close to these beautiful snaking riverbanks of completely pure mud, and the reeds themselves, that are just kind of a virgin. You can't inhabit them. There was this feeling of I could, after 10 minutes I had to go back to the tea room because my hands were cold. And in the Avalon marshes, there are these which are of course quite close to Bristol. There are the remains of these Neolithic tracks going through the marshes that would have enabled humans to hunt in them and to travel through them. I became very interested in our own exclusion from the wild, or our sense of exclusion, and perhaps a kind of Grendel-like impulse to destruction as a result of that, at which there's a necessary need to build paths, and then there's a kind of total domination, which is less helpful. And so I think that one of the kind of hopeful conclusions that came out of that thought process was that when you look at poems like the Old English elegies and the Welsh Claf Aberceawg or Sweeney or whatever they are, you realize that since time immemorial we have depended on the wilderness to articulate our experience of being alive and in the world. and that we actually do have a profound affinity with the wild in our imaginations, and that we need that, and that we can capitalize on that. Wrong word, not capitalize, but we can depend on that, and explore it as we move forward with our new reframing our relationship with nature.
And that comes through in a number of the stories in both books, but particularly in Wild, I think. And when you're standing on the beach at Whitby, that sense of wonder as you view familiar landscapes, as you say, through the earlier ages, and you say animals and birds take on a whole new significance when viewed from a medieval perspective. I think builds to that affinity, but also that responsibility we have as well.
Yes, and that possibility for these things that seem so permanent, like north being at the top. These are just metaphors for articulating the world. And in the medieval imagination, Easter's at the top of the map. We really can do an about turn on our relationship with the wild if we need to, and we are doing that. And the metaphors that we apply to it can change.
You also end the book with Paradise and the voyage of St. Brendan. Tell us about that story, and then tell us about the experience you had when you saw the starlings and the murmuration.
Yes, okay. So the Voyage of St. Brendan is a really fantastic text, and it was very, very popular in the Middle Ages and survives in numerous versions and different translations. And it's one of those stories that people would take and add more to and play with. So I felt a great liberty to do the same in Wild. In the earliest version, it's a 9th century Latin text written in Ireland. And it's a wonder narrative. So it tells a story of how St. Brendan and a small group of monks set sail from the coast of Ireland into the Atlantic in a hide-covered boat with no rudder. And they do this thing which monks did in real life, just go off into the sea. And they're looking for an earthly paradise. But for 7 years, all they do is go around the same islands in turn each year in uncanny consonance with the liturgical feasts. And so it's a bit like a kind of metaphor for communal monasticism in that day and age. It's really, this story has its roots in a non-Christian genre of Irish literature called Imram, which is where a hero goes off on a journey to the other world. And so that's what Brendan's doing. This is just a kind of Christian version of that genre. And he at Easter, I think, so there's some of the islands he meets are really amazing. Some of the islands he meets are really really wonderful and strange. Like, for instance, they come across a whale posing as an island, and Brendan very knowingly lets his brothers get off the boat and make camp on the whale's back, but he doesn't leave the boat because he's always a step ahead. And then when the island starts to move and tremble beneath their feet, they realize their mistake and get back on the boat just in time. Another island has a crystal monastery on it with an arrow comes in the window each evening and lights the sconces on the walls. It's a flaming arrow. That's really amazing kind of secondary world fantasy stuff. There's an island full of really big fluffy sheep. Why not? And they meet Judas Iscariot sitting on a rock, being constantly smacked in the face by the freezing ocean and freezing cold. And he says that on Sundays, God lets him come up from hell to have a little bit of respite. And he thinks that this is the most comfortable rock in the world because it's so much better than the torments of hell. And another island they meet is they meet on Easter Sunday, and it's a very small bit of rock with a great big tree on it. So there's a fountain under the tree, and this huge tree has got its branches spread right out, overhanging the island, and it's completely covered in birds, and they're all singing in unison and singing words including the words of one of the Psalms, which says, how good and how pleasant it is for brothers to dwell in unity. And this seems to be very much in tune with the text's wider interest in communal monasticism, and how that's a good vocation. And one of the birds comes and lands on the prow of the boat and explains that they are fallen angels that got on the way down to hell, kind of got stuck on the firmament, which is the medieval word for earth and the atmosphere, and they're condemned to wander the firmament for the rest of time. But God says that on feast days, high days, and like Easter, they are allowed to take the form of birds, gather together and praise God together. I became really captivated by this image of the birds, and also by the I've been looking at the Lindisfarne Gospels and the decorative device of having these birds interlacing inside the letters of the Gospel, the kind of inside the word of God, and how they might also have been understood as a metaphor for communal monasticism, this kind of discipline and beauty and prayer and all of that. And to then kind of extrapolate from that a non-Christian reading, this kind of with the if as a medieval monk would have understood that he was living in the sixth and final age of the world, as would a medieval nun, she would have understood that too, and that everything they were doing in the knowledge of impending doom, and that was a source of motivation as opposed to despair. I mean, I'm not a subscriber to apocalyptic rhetoric in relation to our current situation. I don't think that's at all helpful, but I do think that there's something very inspiring about this idea of judicious, hopeful action in the knowledge of mortality, and of creating such beautiful things as the Lindisfarne Gospels, if that's within our power, or it might translate itself into knitting a jumper or making tomato soup. But that kind of ordering and creative action, and also then in terms of the medieval mindset, that action actually translated into helping them towards an idea of salvation. And so then we can see that as taking positive action in relation to whatever existential threat we feel we're facing, that hope is the only option, that despair is not an option, and apathy is just lazy. So these are the things that I was kind of going around in my head, and I went off to the Avalon marshes to watch one of the starling murmurations, and it was just one of we got to the Hamwall Nature Reserve, went at dawn, because at least then that the starlings are there. If you go in the evenings, you're not entirely sure where they're going to roost, and they put a badge up on the map with a little starling on it so that you can make your way to the nearest viewing point. And again, it's a bit like taking that path through the fenland. You've got to follow these old roads, but at either side of you is this lovely wilderness of reed beds and marsh and lakes, and we arrived, and the kind of the birds, it just sounded like you knew you were approaching, because you could hear this sound as if of applause. And you can see the other bird watchers standing there with their bacon butties and their binoculars. And you just can't wait for that moment when they start to fly. And then they took off, and then, it was this silence fell, because they'd all been chattering on the reeds, and then suddenly they lift up as one. And it's such a strange noise that they make. It's like a rain stick on steroids. It's incredible. And you're watching them in this perfect cohesion, kind of like a lava lamp across the sky. I mean, we've all seen pictures of it, and just to stand beneath it was so much more exciting and awe-inspiring even than that. And so that's really the image that that of the island of birds and the image of the starling murmurations is what I close the book on, and really a reflection on harmony as opposed, and the sort of daily exertion of nudging the suspended elements of life into something like harmony, and taking that cue from the medieval example. Rather than this kind of quest for an earthly paradise or immortality. Yeah, so that's really how the starling murmuration comes into it.
I mean, I'm very much taken with that, and I was taken with some of the sources of hope that you refer to. Like you, I don't like this apocalyptic, and take action where you can, create art in that way. You have a wonderful moment when the monks are looking at the Gospels. And thinking about, if doom approaches, what they asked the question, what would we do differently? And creating those Gospels was one example of that, I think. Just talking about finally about the future. We've been involved in a lot of discussions about how we become good ancestors, and you've brought a wonderful term there about the path creating and so on that you've talked about there. And there's great relevance in what you've written about in terms of this, I think. And I just wondered if you could end on what you would hope people, say, living 1,000 years from now, might look back on us and with admiration rather than with in mind the difficulties of the challenges that we then set them.
Yes, well, I mean, I think that we look back at the Middle Ages and think of gruesome executions and misogyny and racism, and wasn't the most squeaky clean of eras at all, and there were tyrants, and there was horrible inequality, but, and this is a but that doesn't redeem those things. We also have these artworks and these poems that speak of a really they speak of the humanity of people living then, and of the quest to find solace and make peace with the difficulties of life, and to pay attention to the outcast, the exiled one, the monstrous one, as it's perceived by society, the woman who is trapped or enslaved in a relationship, and so I think that what you said, taking action where we can, and creating, whether it's as scientists or artists or parents or whatever it may be, there is a possibility that people 1,000 years from now will find our work and see that we were doing our best and striving for beauty.
Well, thank you very much, Amy Jeffs. Storyland and Wild are published by River Run Books. They are terrific reads, and as I said in the introduction, they're also beautiful to look at. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Andrew.